So I wanted to talk about transitions also today and didn't get time because we ran over because, Jodie Foster took too long. But I do want to point out and define kind of what transitions are. If you remember earlier today, we talked about your main points and setting up your outline. Well, let's say you have two main points in your speech. When you are moving in your speech from your intro to your first main point, that's a transition. When you go from your main point one to main point two, that's a transition. When you go from main point two to the conclusion, that's also a transition. So the transition is the connection piece that helps you go from one part of the speech to the next part of the speech. And there's a couple of different ways to do it. It's important because you just don't want to go from, here's my introduction, my point one is, my point two is, my conclusion is. We don't have smooth flow. It doesn't have a conversational feel. You don't talk like that in a conversation ever. You want to have it more like a story, and stories have transitions, and we let people know, okay, we've talked about this, we're going to move to that. What I just did is a transition. And if you look at the speech graded rubrics, transitions are always talked about in those rubrics. Did you use transitions? Did you use them well? Did you forget to put them in? There's even elements in the outlining. As you get deeper into the speeches, the rubric elements for the outlines get more complicated and there's more elements to it. And one of them is, did you put transitions in your outline and did you use them in your speech? In your speech and that kind of thing. So that's why it's important to include them and practice them just like you would for the rest of the speech. So transition statements are nothing more than you are now moving from one point to another and you're letting your audience know exactly what you're doing. So if you go back to that Josephine Baker example, when we were talking about organizational patterns, we talked about Josephine Baker. And if you remember, she was a spy, she was an entertainer, and she was a civil rights leader. So regardless of which organizational pattern you use, you will want to, like today, I'm here to talk to you about Josephine Baker. She was an amazing woman in the early and middle 19th century or 20th century who was a spy. She was a civil rights leader and she was an entertainer. And so I want to talk about all three of those. So first, let's talk about Josephine Baker as an entertainer. So what I just did and now let's talk about Josephine Baker as an entertainer. That's a transition statement. And so then I would talk about her as an entertainer, and then I would move into another transition statement and say, okay, now we've talked about her as an entertainer. Let me tell you how she incorporated that into being a spy. And so that's another transition example. You want to use these transitions in your speeches. There's a couple of ways to do it. One of them is an internal preview. So you actually preview for the audience how you're going to present the information so they know ahead of time, okay, they're going to talk about this, then they're going to talk about this, then they're going to talk about this. So in the Josephine Baker, I want to talk about Josephine Baker. She was an amazing woman. She had three different aspects of her career. And so first, I'm going to talk about Josephine Baker, the entertainer, and how famous she was and what an impact she had. And then we'll talk about Josephine Baker and her contributions to the World War II and the French underground and how she helped defeat the Nazis. And after that, we'll talk about how she helped lead and be a part of the civil rights movement in the US. Now, what I just did was I did a preview transition, and you already know as the audience what my three main points are, how we're going to cover them, in what order we're going to cover them, and then we could start talking about Josephine Baker as the entertainer. So that's an internal preview because you're previewing what you're going to talk about. There's also something called an internal summary, and it summarizes the preceding points. So where this is different, let's say, so I've introduced you to the idea of Josephine Baker. Now let me tell you about her as an entertainer and the popularity and the impact that she had in the world of entertainment. And so I've summarized the intro into first point. Now I get done with my first point about her being an entertainer. Now we've talked about her brilliance as an entertainer and the impact that she had, but let's go into her as a spy. And then later on, I would say, okay, so we've talked about Josephine Baker, the entertainer, and Josephine Baker, the spy, and how they were incorporated together. We also are going to look at how she used that in civil rights. And so then we move into civil rights. So you're summarizing what you've talked about. You're going to see some good examples in a minute. So you can use internal previews, you can use internal summaries, and some people use both actually to extend out their speech, but it's an important element that you've got to have. Now, here are some examples of previews and summaries in transition statements, and you'll clearly be able to spot the transitions statements as they're used in these examples.
Now that we have a clear understanding of the problem, let me share my solution with you.
I've spoken so far of bravery and of patriotism, but it is the sacrifice of the 54th that has etched them into the pages of history.
Now that we've seen how drinking too much is a serious problem for students and their communities, let's look at some causes.
Keeping these points in mind about sign language, let's return to the sentence I started with and see if we can learn the signs for "you are my friend."
Now that we've taken a look at what Feng Shui is, let's put this newfound knowledge into practice.
So you see, it just is a way of making a smooth move from one main point to another, or you can use transitions from the sub point to a sub point, or from a sub point to the next main point. They add to the storytelling part of giving a speech, and they keep the audience more interested, more engaged than just jumping blind from one step to the next one without having these smooth moves. You know, it feels much better to the audience to have the transitions in your speeches. So that was the last piece I wanted to cover. Probably didn't take 5 or 10 minutes, but we were really running out of time, and I definitely wanted you to see the Made in China speech. So that's it for this week. I'll see you Friday when we do our self-intro speeches. Talk to you later.